Next, we invite Mr. Martín Creaner, Director General from WBBA, to deliver a speech on the LATAM broadband development. Please welcome him with a big round of applause.
Well, good morning, everyone, and I'm really delighted to have the opportunity to be here today to talk about, I suppose, what is consistent with a lot of the presentations we've heard this morning about how broadband can really drive greater socioeconomic benefit for the whole world and particularly for LATAM. I'm Martin Creaner, and I'm the Director General of the World Broadband Association. And for those of you who don't know what the WBBA is, WBBA has been formed relatively recently, over the last 2 years, by some of the largest companies in the industry. And based on an initiative that was kicked off by the ITU. And the idea is to create an industry association that is focused on accelerating the rollout of the next generation of broadband, but accelerating it so that it certainly is able to deliver the socioeconomic benefits that we're hoping to get from the next generation of broadband, making sure that it is delivering the type of broadband that both consumers and vertical industries need in order to help themselves digitally transform, but also, very crucially, developing a next generation of broadband that has got a guaranteed sustainable financial return for the key stakeholders. And by that, I mean primarily the operators, but also the other players in the ecosystem. We've all been aware for many years about how difficult it is to generate a financial return for all the connectivity that we deliver. And the next generation of broadband needs to be designed in order to focus on protecting that financial return. Like any industry organization, the World Broadband Association has working groups between its members. The main focus of the working groups at the moment are around, first of all, defining the generational roadmap for how we get from here to there, how we move from the current scenario of DSL and cable and so on to an all-fiber future at some stage in the future for fixed broadband. And how we do that in a sensible way that's going to be financially sustainable for operators. We're also very interested in the whole area of success stories on broadband right across the world. The World Broadband Organization is a global organization, and so things are moving at different speeds in different parts of the world. And what we're really interested in is gathering the case studies and success stories from different parts of the world, both in terms of what types of projects work, what business models work, what arguments work with governments and regulators, and so on, in order to accelerate the next generation of broadband. And we're very interested in sustainability. The next generation of broadband is going to be emerging between now and 2030, 2035, and sustainability is going to be hugely important in that period of time. We have to ensure that the next generation of broadband is delivering against the sustainability goals of the world. And the WBBA is also producing custom research, bespoke events. It's also developing business cases for the next generation of broadband, as well as engaging in conversations with partners, with the wider ecosystem, with regulators, with governments, and so on. If you want to consider how best to roll out the next generation of broadband anywhere in the world, but LATAM is a great example, there's really 4 key imperatives. There has to be a hand-in-glove discussion with governments and with regulators. This is no longer a discussion. The next generation of broadband is not an initiative by operators. The next generation of broadband is a national economic policy, and that has to be done in a way that the governments need to be supporting the next generation of broadband. Otherwise, it's not going to happen in a way that suits the rest of the world. It has to be tied in with the needs of vertical industries. Vertical industries and consumers are the customers of next generation broadband. And we heard Bob Kai talk this morning about how B2B is very important for the next generation of broadband, but it's absolutely essential that we understand the requirements of those industries. Quality of service is going to be essential, the whole end-to-end experience. And it's becoming mission critical, and so we have to ensure that we've got mission critical capability in terms of quality of service. And we have to build a future-proof network because nobody knows what's coming. One of the speakers today was talking about interplanetary, between the Earth and the Moon, broadband connectivity, which seems very far out into the future. But the reality is, I was sitting in a room in 2010 talking about what sort of bandwidth this current generation of broadband would need. And we concluded a very small percentage, 2 or 3%, would need anything above 100 megabits. The reality is we were totally wrong. We had gotten the scale entirely wrong. And so now we're talking about gigabits and tens of gigabits and up to terabits, but we might still be wrong, so we need to build a future-proof network. So let me talk about those 4 key points. Nobody argues the fact that connectivity and economic success are tightly linked. The more connectivity a country has, the greater the GDP. And the more broadband that a country has, the greater GDP. And the more fixed broadband or fibre broadband, and even greater GDP. There's a tight linkage between the availability of broadband and the economic success of countries. And so that's why governments are so totally invested in the next generation of broadband. What we need is to ensure, and we see that when Mexico's had a great initiative where it's rolling out, it really gets it, I think, in this country where there's free internet access points and so on, and a strategy for rolling out fibre across the country. But the reality is, in every country, and right across this region, and every country in the world, there are discussions going on between governments and between operators on how to best drive the rollout of broadband and this next generation of enhanced broadband. And to do that, both by removing the barriers, and we heard a great presentation from Colombian regulator talking about removing barriers in particularly 5G. But the reality, we need to remove both those physical and legal barriers, but we also need to create incentives for how operators can roll this out in a way that's going to be financially sustainable. And we need to have that type of relationship as well with a much wider ecosystem, with the vertical industries that are going to use broadband, because the vertical industry requirements are going to be really driving what we need for the next generation of broadband. This is not a technical discussion about what the network should look like. This is really about a capability discussion on what the next generation of vertical industries and consumers and the metaverse are going to require from broadband. And when we look at things like the impact of COVID, we've seen a massive increase, as we all know, in terms of educating at home and working from home and communicating with people when we couldn't travel. We've seen big impacts in healthcare, in automotive, in retail, and those changes are not going to, we're not going to reverse back from those changes. We're going to need that constant level of increasing and improving broadband. But it's understanding the demands that are going to be placed on broadband. There is no point in us developing a next generation of super fibre broadband, super 5G broadband, on the assumption that all we need to do is to build it and they will come. We need to understand the requirements in detail. And the WBBA is tightly focused on understanding the requirements of vertical industries, from manufacturing to healthcare to automotive, so that we can place the requirements in a timely fashion back into the broadband industry, so that we build a network that the vertical industries and the consumers need at the time they need it, not before and not after. But also it's important, one of the things the World Broadband Association is doing is gathering success stories, but particularly success stories in terms of business models, because we will need to be very inventive in terms of what business models we offer in the future. We've pretty much offered the same business models today that we have done since the inception of the industry. But going forward, flexibility in business models from the operators are going to be essential in order to be able to deliver broadband to the customers in a fashion that is going to make them able to pay for this. And that doesn't mean reducing price, but it means targeting different price tiers for different levels of sophistication around latency or security or reliability or availability and so on. It's also really important to understand that quality of service, as we move into this next generation of broadband, quality of service is going to become mission critical. It's at the moment we tend to be able to buy broadband on a best efforts basis. In the future, that's just not going to be good enough. We have to be able to get it where we want, when we want, and where we get the quality and the reliability that we expect. And that requires significant investment in a robust infrastructure. And that is expensive. So the only way we're going to be able to invest in the robust sort of infrastructure that's going to create a broadband for the future is by cooperation with governments and regulators and other investors so that we can fund this properly. At the moment, and I've spent 35 years working in the telecoms industry all over the world, and there's never been a tougher time to generate a business case for significant investment in the industry than it is today. And so we need to find ways to enable those business cases to be developed. And we need to also see what business cases are working in different parts of the world. What's working in Korea for that investment? What's working in New Zealand? What's working in Kansas? What's working in Ireland? And when we understand those business cases, we need to be able to build them out and share them among the WBBA members. Different levels of quality as well are really important to think about, because we don't just need super high quality for everything for every service. The vast majority of services will probably need a lower level of quality in terms of speed and availability, but then there's certain services as we move towards things like, I don't know, remote surgery or digital twin in manufacturing, or remote driving or remote robotics and so on. We might need the 10 gigabits, 100 gigabit sort of bandwidth with 6 nines availability and sub-microsecond latency. But quite frankly, for the vast majority of scenarios, you will probably just need much more simple levels of broadband. So the next generations of broadband need to be structured in such a way that it's economically viable to deliver low-cost broadband for low-demand, for low-challenging services, whilst also being able to build business models that price appropriately based on value for the really complex and high-reliability services. And how we structure that and how we see that beginning to work in certain parts of the world, the WBBA is collating that and understanding those new business models so that it can share it back to its members, so that we can begin to build those business models into operators everywhere in the world. I know this is only a short presentation, but what we're really keen to do at this time is to grow the membership of the WBBA in LATAM, and to get a number of operators and ecosystem players in LATAM to participate and join with the WBBA. As the WBBA builds up its arguments for governments and regulators, as it builds up its library of case studies and business models, as it builds up its structures and ideas around how to construct value capture and value creation within the next generation of broadband. We want to share that and see that work in all parts of the world. And so from a global perspective, the WBBA is keen that discussions begin early on with governments, with regulators, with the much broader ecosystem of the hyperscalers and OTT players, and also the device manufacturers. We need to understand the timing between when the services are going to be available, because we want to make sure that when the broadband is available, the services are going to be available in order to use that broadband infrastructure. If the network arrives before the services are available, it's very hard to make money. And if the network isn't there when the services are available, we're damaging the potential GDP growth. So we need to make sure that we lock those two things together closely. So the WBBA calls on all the stakeholders in the industry to participate, to join the WBBA and participate in building this movement towards the definition of a next generation of broadband, not as a technical initiative, but as a set of arguments and understandings for how we're going to make this a financial success for everybody involved in the industry. Thank you.